this final panel got the title of Black Study and Producing Black Freedom in the World. And we thought that in the midst of the kind of itinerary that we've been charting today in this workshop, that it would make sense to us for us to finish on this question of what kind of invention, what kind of swerve, what kind of play does Black study bring into this question of making Black freedom in the world. And we've been very deliberate not to say Black studies as it's emerged in the US in recent years, but Black study as a practice, as an attitude, as a way of thinking and approaching, following from someone like Hortense Spillers, as a critical insurgency, as a posture of reading, right? And the inspiration for that from the South African side is Biko's famous quip in the BPC Sasso trial when the prosecutor keeps asking him what the different articles mean that he's written in I Write What I Like in the periodical, yeah? And he says at one point, he says, "Can't you read?" And this, whether or not the state can read, it becomes a recurring refrain in the proceedings of the Sasso BPC trial. And it doesn't mean can you thread a text through your eyeballs, right? He's talking about reading in the proper sense with a capital R, right? The reading that is a vulnerability that takes you somewhere that you're not necessarily prepared to go. And so it's in that spirit that we've invited, I must get you guys in the right order, Tendai Sitole on the end. He's a professor in the Department of Political Sciences at UNISA. He is the author of far too many books, which makes us ask where he finds the time to write them all. But most recently, Biko's Edge, there was a launch, I think 2 weeks ago in Cape Town. He's also the author of, sorry, my writing is small, On Maboho More's Extended Thought, Hortense Spillers, Subject, Abject, and Insurgent in Black Radical Thought. He's got a book called Black X with Wits University Press, Refiguring in Black, The Letter in Black Radical Thought, Maboho More, Philosophical Anthropology in Azania, and many, many, many more. Next to Tendai is Dr. Lindo Kuchle Gama, who is coming to us from Northwest University in the Department of Philosophy. Her research is at the nexus of, she's in philosophy, and I also work in philosophy, but good grief. So her research is at the nexus of non-ideal value theories, critical social theory, and African feminism. Her work engages deeply with African philosophy, particularly examining the afterlives of settler colonialism and its ongoing impact on contemporary social and political realities. And then next to Dr. Gama is Prof. Kumalo, who we invited to do a Humanities in Session lecture here. And then he invited Aidan and myself up into his Black Archive project up at UJ, and it started a bit of a dialogue, interlocution. Is that the right way to use the word? So he is associate professor at the Ali Mazrui Center for Higher Education Studies at UJ, and his work focuses on African political theory, decolonial thought, and higher education and epistemic justice. He is a Harvard South Africa fellow, and serves on the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Global Ethics. Good grief, is that still the same title? Symposium Steering Committee. Yo. And he leads the NRF-funded Black Archive project. That's enough from me. I'm going to hand it over to them. They'll present in the order that, so it's going to go 4 hours, 2 hours, 2 minutes. I hope everybody's buckled in. And afterwards, we will have some questions and engagement.
I don't want to think about a Black study in relation to the way like that we know it, vis-a-vis, Stefano Hani and Fred Moten. But I want to ground myself in them, but in a form of a riff, because in a riff, in a sense that there is a concept that I've been wrestling with, which I want to propose. I don't coin concepts, I propose. It's called Lexis Praxis. Lexis Praxis, like in a sense that black study, if it's an attitude, if it is a practice, we must call it blackitude. That how do black people come together to engage in the form of study, right? And when I'm saying this Lexis Praxis, I'm thinking about even the idea of access, where in which study is about imagination, study must flow and overflow, study must elude containment, because we are here in this country called South Africa. We are finding that even the radical vocabulary gets appropriated. Everyone is decolonial, but 2011, 2014, some of us were persona non gratas, where we were even told that we'll never get our PhDs, but we insisted because we knew that we had to do what we had to do. So that was a black study. So when I'm thinking about this very idea of Lexis praxis, moving beyond this containment, that it's a form of study that smashes, it reaves, it traces, it highlights, it reducts, like it does all this kind of movement. And the question is not about this very idea of legibility, that we must say things. What do things mean? Like we saw even with the iteration that we had here, like on stage. It's not a performance, it's not, but it's something that has what I will call glossolalia, like, that which cannot be articulated by language. And we need like those kind of thought practices, because it is interesting even in this country that the question of slavery is not even in the constitution. This country. The problem of this country is apartheid, 1948. So 1948 backwards, nothing happened. The land question starts in 1913, right? Like there is so much, and how do we study, right? And it is unfortunate that the kinds of studies that came with a lot of epistemic erasures, and I always say that the post 1994 is a crime scene, but it's a crime scene without a crime, no perpetrator, and it's so sad that even in this country, there's no white person who supported apartheid, including members of the Freedom Front Plus. It's so shocking. Like I was in Centurion 16 December, and because I was going to the office during the public holiday, so I was like, no, I can't drive through Fountain Valley because of. So when I went through the Voortrekker Monument, I spoke to some of the people there. So, it's many of you here, what's happening? But nobody supported apartheid, right? And the problem is, we are even stuck even with apartheid. We don't even know that this country was built on slavery and settler colonialism. That South Africa is a geographical name, right? Like we're living in a country without a name. It's a geographic reference. And what is even interesting with this country is that there is even the huge debate of secession, this city that we are in. Like, that thing is not even being spoken about. right? And they keeps it. And then keeps it, you won't find settler colonialism, like, it's all about the past. But when you ask, what is this past? There's no language for it. But this language is not glossolalia, it's deliberate linguistic amnesia, right? So how do we think about such tragic things? I will propose that if we think about Lexis praxis, that we have to rid ourselves of this investment of possession. For instance, decolonization is now a liberal script. Every university is now decolonizing, right? There was a, a professor who was giving an inaugural lecture, like, hey, we must decolonize this. And I had to tear them apart, right? Precisely of saying people lost their careers. People never got, like, an opportunity to advance. People, like, suffered, right? Having to use this concept. Today, like, it's a speak, right? So even this project of Black Study is gonna get appropriated, right? I think when we do Lexis Praxis, like, we must let go. When the liberal machine comes with this appropriation, right? Making this thing legible, like look at even radical concepts like affect. They've been hijacked, right? Oh, it's about affect, touching the other. And the person who says that it is the most toxic and violent person. We must care for each other. Let's build communities. Oh, and I'm saying this with a spirit of seriousness, that we have to let go of possession. Like, when they come for these radical concepts, let's go elsewhere. And I think this elsewhere, it's what, even this concept of the aftermath, right? We're thinking about the aftermath, but there's no question about settler colonialism. Like, even like the issue of slavery. They said, no, it happened in Cape Town. If you go to Iziko, oh, it was so, oh, the Cape Malay. You're like, no, but this thing, it hits the whole continent. It hits the whole world, right? And I believe that we have to move beyond these limits. But moving beyond these limits is not these transcendental moves of wanting solutions. We must stay with the problem, right? And if we stay with the problem vis-a-vis Lexis praxis, we must refuse, like, this very idea of being comfortable. If the NRF chair that we are holding, it's called Black Study. If liberals, like, take it, let go of that chair, do something else, right? And I'm saying this because of the stakes are very high, like that we have been given these lofty things, and then there is a refusal to the practice that is being made. So I just want to propose that Black Study is that which is outside any form of formalist standards. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'll let go of the concepts you're talking about as well one day. But so when Moritz suggested this panel, he said this should be a discussion around being in the wake of slavery and Black freedom. And often when I hear the term Black freedom, I immediately freeze. Because to me, it sounds very oxymoronic. Not because Black people are not struggling for freedom, because clearly we have, and we've been relentlessly doing so, but because Blackness itself emerges historically within a world structured through its denial that seems to continuously persist even today. So to be rendered Black in the modern world is to be positioned outside of this category of fully human, outside of the domain of the free subject. And as I see more and more of the becoming Black of the world and more libidinal attachments to this anti-Black world, and the ways that it's thwarting this kind of solidarities that we've been speaking about over the past 2 days, my pessimism really rears its head. And, I kind of begin to lose hope in these ideas of affect, of resistance, and the smaller kind of ways that we can kind of fight against structure. I think back to watching TV with my little cousins and sisters, watching Trump interacting with Cyril Ramaphosa, watching him interact with the Liberian president. And what does that mean? How do you keep hope watching someone make such a mockery of African people? And more than that, watching a fellow African put other African people under the bus for gains that will be undone in any case. And the open air prisons that we see, whether it be Congo, whether it be Palestine, whether it be wherever you can point out into the world. And it becomes quite difficult, I think, to think about Black freedom as an attainable thing. And more than that, and I'm quite reticent to say this because of this machine that's recording me, but really there seems to only be one kind of language that's understood here. Because trying to, I mean, we think of other thinkers before us who try to appeal to the better consciousness of our oppressors, and they told us outrightly that will not work. And it seems whether ceasefires, whatever the case may be, it's not working. And I don't know if we don't want to accept what needs to be done, whether we are not prepared to do what needs to be done. But discussing Black freedom for me, I think, if we keep it into rooms like this and conceptually think about it, while we all know that what it requires is to take up the very violence being put before us and to be brave and to be courageous, yeah, it's of course quite unsettling for me. But because I am an academic and I don't know if I'm prepared to take up arms myself, because it's quite easy to say it, right? Let's take up arms, let's react in the same kind of violence. But there's a lot that goes on with that, and there are lots of pros and cons that are quite difficult to reconcile with. So because of that, then, I try to think about the ways that this contradiction perhaps opens way into thinking about unfreedom in a different kind of a way. Because while these theories of social death and anti-Blackness, I think, are diagnosing the situation quite well, I do not think that our lives are fully constituted by social death. That's not to say this life here is meaningful. That's not to say that all of a sudden social life must be what we hold on to. But if unfreedom were total, there would be no kind of Black sociality. There'd be no intimacy. There'd be no care. I'm thinking here of Njabulu Ndebele saying, even though apartheid and colonialism was happening, we still found ways to make sure you greet your grandmother. You don't use your left hand when you're accepting something, use your right hand. These small moments are moments, I think, of humanizing that may not be pointing towards the structural issue, but are ways in which we can think about world making. And this is why in my own work, I turn to the life worlds of Black women, because I'm interested in the ways that Black women inhabit the space between foreclosure and possibility, and how they navigate structures that deny them full recognition, but take those very same structures and use them for survival and care. And we can talk a little bit more about that in terms of what that means. So my concern here is how to think of a form of life that is structurally constrained, yet never fully reducible to that constraint. So what do we do with that? Do we call that freedom? Do we call it resistance? And so when I think of Christina Sharp's notion of the wake, I think it's quite useful to think about Black life not simply as existing after slavery, existing after colonialism, existing after apartheid, but as living with its ongoing disturbances, with this unresolved aftermath of history, and that life exists in the wake for Black people, and this tension between these partial freedoms and these enduring unfreedoms, and how that survival is something that we can tap into while we develop the balls to do what we actually need to do. So I don't want to frame Black freedom as a completed condition, as though there is some clean exit from domination, but I want to think about Black freedom as this ongoing chipping away in our everyday, that's continually attempting to fight against this foreclosure of Black being. And maybe then we can get to some kind of understanding of unfreedom, that fragility and that continuous struggle that exists between this tension of structural change that's very much needed, but the navigating the everyday of while we wait for freedom to come, how do I live a life of dignity? Thanks.
The 2 points that I pick up from my colleagues, dare I even say friends. The first proposition is the notion of letting go of radical thought once it is captured and domesticated by the liberal tradition. The second proposition is that black freedom is constrained and obscured by structural conditions. And so I want to think about both of these propositions then in relation to the work that I do in the Black Archive. And I'll start us off with a particular disclaimer that's in a paper that should be coming out fairly soon. And I write that in my scholarship, and this is something that I've been critiqued for, by the way, I use the concept of indigeneity and blackness relationally and at times interchangeably within the South African context. I do so consciously aware that contemporary indigeneity studies have often sought to distinguish indigenous identity from racial categories produced through colonial modernity. However, the South African historical condition presents a particular configuration that complicates an easy separation between the indigenous and black subject. My use of blackness here does not merely denote a racial category produced through the taxonomies of colonial conquest and apartheid classification. It signifies the historical condition of the conquered native subject, whose modes of being, relation to land, epistemic traditions, and political existence were disrupted through settler colonialism. Importantly, many of the historical figures and writers that I engage in my scholarship did not initially speak in the language of blackness as it emerged through 20th century anti-colonial and anti-apartheid struggle. They referred to themselves variously as natives, Africans, or through colonial categories imposed upon them, including the derogatory nomenclature of the colonial state itself. I will not use it, however, we do know what it is. The later emergence of blackness within South African political discourse, therefore, represented not simply the adoption of a racial identity, but the political consolidation of those subjected to conquest, dispossession, and epistemic subordination. Blackness becomes inseparable from the historical condition of indigeneity in South Africa, insofar as it names those peoples, whose existence preceded colonial settlement, and whose political, linguistic, and ontological worlds were subjected to colonial interruption. My deployment, then, of indigeneity is therefore not intended as an essentialist claim to racial purity or autochthony, but rather as an ontological and historical orientation toward land, memory, and belonging. It signifies forms of life that emerge from the earth itself, ways of being constituted relationally through language, custom, ancestry, and place, rather than identities reducible solely to the racial abstractions of capitalism and colonial administration. In this respect, my usage aligns with broader currents within global indigeneity studies that understand indigenous identity not merely as a juridical category, but as a relation to land, historical continuity, and alternative modes of world-making that persist despite colonial modernity. I open with this footnote, and you can tell it's quite a long footnote. I open with this footnote in my contribution to this discussion precisely because I want to take the idea of freedom, or I want to read the concept of freedom and thinking with the concept of freedom in Black study using the work and scholarship of the folks that I engage with. The majority of them are underread, under-theorized, precisely because they write in indigenous languages, specifically isiXhosa. And for those who might not know the South African historical framing of the press arrives in 1823 in South Africa. By 1831, we do have the first articulations of the orthography of isiXhosa being printed in Lovedale. Lovedale is in the Kume Valley in the Eastern Cape, 5 kilometers away from the University of Fort Hare, for those who might be familiar with South Africa but don't know Lovedale Press. So by 1831, we see the first orthographical representation of isiXhosa. And what happens is that you have this class of Black intellectuals who begin to write, right? And remember that if we are writing in 1831, 1820, we have the quote unquote official arrival of the 1820 settlers, right? So you begin to have a major colonial administration of the British colony. You begin to have this move towards, moving inland. You have black indigenous subjects being converted into Christianity by the missionaries, being educated by the missionaries. You have black labor being forced into a colonial economy through the confiscation of cattle and land. The economy is shifting quite radically, and black intellectuals are writing about this existence, are writing about this reality very seriously, and they're engaging with it. Now, by 1860, I think 1862, all the way to 1888, you have this kind of burgeoning development around black publications, right? And the most famous ones that we know are Isigidi Misamaxhosa, Imvo Zabansundu, Mthetheleli Wabantu. And these are coming out, and it's not just, by the way, presses that are, or conversations or journals or publications limited to the Eastern Cape. They're inviting contributions from all over the country, right? And the one particular character that I focus on, there are two of them. I focus on Ugoba and I focus on Umkai. The one character that, the latter one, that is Umkai, becomes articulable or known as Imbongi Yesizwe, right? The poet of the nation. And the fundamental reason why he's the poet of the nation is because we're not seeing these ethnic classifications that come up when the apartheid state begins to do its work, right? Blunting the senses, as Pramesh would put it. So there is a generally broad conversation that's happening across the country amongst black intellectuals in different languages, and you've got folks writing. That particular work that's happening in Lovedale is in conversation with work that's happening in KwaZulu-Natal in the Colenso School, right? So you have the Colenso Missionary School, you have intellectuals like Make Mafuze, for example, and that particular tradition gives rise to Udube's project with the school in KZN, I forget now, Ohlang, yes. So you see this fundamental pivot, and this pivot is happening because black intellectuals, quote unquote, want to assert their humanity. They want to be read as legible within the colonial administrating framework. And so I return then to that black intellectual tradition. Number one, because black intellectuals were writing against colonial incursion as it was happening in real time. It is not a abstracted consideration. It is a writing against empire. It is a negotiation with empire. It is a desire to be read as subjects of empire, right? And it is a conversation of attempting to convert those who refuse conversion, what later become known as amaqaba, right? And we see this quite clearly, and I think the one example that I often use is the example of Ugoba. In 1885, he does the Lovedale Literary Society address titled The Natives' Laws, Customs and Beliefs. And he's quite derisive toward Ubukaba, as I call it, right? Toward the indigene who refuses conversion. And I read him as a complicated character, not to say that he's derisive because he's wholesale had a drink from the chalice of quote-unquote European Christianity and conversion. No, because he's mediating a relationship with his audience. And this is the only text, by the way, that he writes in English. Everything else that Ugoba does from 1884 up until his untimely death in 1888, he's writing in isiXhosa, right? This is the only text that he's writing in English, and he's writing it in English precisely because he's negotiating a particular relationship. And he closes that text by saying that the two cultures ought to study one another, and in the deepening of that study, there'll be less animosity between the two, right? So I go back then to this particular tradition precisely because this tradition is aware of a world that existed. So I suppose I go back to this tradition because we cannot accuse this tradition of the gaps of orature, right? So when we think about orature, we can say, oh, certain things change, certain things move differently in history because, you know, things are misheard, broken telephone type of chat, right? So here we have recorded history that is published, that is debated, and you have a number of colleagues who are also thinking with me around this particular question. And I'm thinking of Uhlonipha Mokoena as one of them, right? Ilanga lase Natali, and he writes about, what is it, an assembly of readers in the Southern African, Journal of Southern African Studies in 2009. So you see this public appreciation of the world of letters, and a public deliberation to the question of social organization and social politics, right? So, and I read Mokoena in conversation with Mazisi Kunene, who decries, Mazisi Kunene that is, the privatization of the culture of deliberation because of the introduction of the printed press and the printed word, as it were. As a way of concluding this long story that I'm sort of trying to paint for us here, is to say that I articulate the possibility then of Black study through this tradition precisely because of a case that I see published by u-Iziko Mkai in the figure or in the historical representation of uMaqoma, and specifically the detailing of Maqoma's court. And in detailing Maqoma's court, Mkai translates a publication that was done by Charles Williams, right, who had witnessed this thing, writes it in English, he translates it into isiXhosa, and he spreads it around. There are two things that strike me about that. The first is, and I'm going to just take one particular scenario here, a white man from the Cape travels into the Eastern Cape, what is now known as the Eastern Cape Territory in any case, has a slave, is upset with their slave's conduct, beats the slave to a pulp, nearly to a pulp in any case, and goes further and says, I'm going to now lay a charge against you, i.e. my slave, in Maqoma's court. Before Maqoma deliberates or arbitrates on the case, he says something that's quite fascinating. He says that the notion of a slave does not exist in Xhosa land. And so he dissolves this modernity or this category of modernity, which is the notion of a human as property, right? That's the first move that he does. He says it does not exist, and so I will treat the case as a case of two men who had struck a bargain between each other. The case gets ventilated, the court pronounces its judgment, and the court finds in favor of the slave, frees the slave, finds the Englishman, and finds him an ox as, costs of the court. The white man's response, the Englishman's response, is rather telling, because the Englishman then says, you, Maqoma, do not know things of modernity, and I am now going to take a charge against you to the governor, Governor Colonel Somerset, right? Because he is the one who is in charge even of you. And that's interesting for me because of two things. The first is, how do we understand, or how would Black study be constituted, predicated on this world that I'm reading, that first and foremost sees the notion of a human reduced to property as an unacceptable, as an incomprehensible thing to begin with. But secondly, and this is the project that I'm currently working on, and hopefully it will be out by next year, post-liberal futures. Lindo is sighing here. I'm sure she's thinking, you are here talking as opposed to writing, so you should have been writing this very book. So in the second instance, then I then say, okay, cool. If we were to then do this kind of work of predicating a world on this, post-liberal futures suggest to me that, or the way that I'm articulating post-liberal futures in any case, suggests to me that fundamentally a world that is not detained by the constructions of liberal categories might do well in going back to this particular archive, which I term the Black Archive. Now, the South African Academy, and I promise I'm finishing up here, the South African Academy, I think, has been limited because 30 years into democracy, and the majority of our academics, other than those of us who actually grew up on these languages and studied these languages, have no access to this particular world. And so I think that that limitation is something that Black study as a organizing logic into our disciplinary formations, right? So I see Black study as sort of the overarching thing, and it feeds into philosophy, history, historiography, political studies, etc., or political science. It should, I think for me, inspire us to capacitate ourselves with the languages that defined how the colonial reality was spoken about by the very people who were under the incursion of colonial expansion, right? Because if we continue to read the colonial archive as a official record of how it is that coloniality frames the Black subject and or other subjects, indigenous subjects on the southernmost tip of the African continent, I think we'll fail to imagine the futures. I think we might, if we get into this archive, overcome the structural constraints that Ugama speaks about. And I think in that way we might be able, although I'm not too sure if I would agree with Usitole here of letting go, because how do I let go of my language? Ulimi engalincelebeleni. I'll stop there.
Oh, interested to find out, has there been a study on any departments, like are there departments that do exist called Black Studies in South Africa? I know there are some African studies in which maybe it may fall under, but I'm quite curious if there are standalone Black Studies departments in South Africa, if anyone knows.
I'm very much curious about the context of the discussion today, and even, you know, the ways in which we had different colleagues talk about, let's say, slavery in South Africa, but globally as well, and sort of linking that with I suppose the North American genealogies of Black study, and I think what I mean by that is also looking at how, let's say, in the last 5 years or 7 years, there's been a shift in terms of the sort of emergence or insistence on particular ways of theorizing Black life. And I think that also very much links to how we talk about slavery, because I think in my head, and I'm sure, I hope, at least I wonder whether other people are thinking about this, is, for an example, how Afro-pessimism as a meta theory does insist on particular formulations around Black life. And listening to the colleagues speak there's this consistent kind of insistence that attempts to think about Black life, but drawing different conclusions as to what we can make of Black life today. And it's not a matter of trying to come to a particular singular framework or narrative or way of viewing Black life in the wake of slavery, but rather ask, I suppose, the state of Black studies, but also in relation to the slave master dialectic in a country like South Africa. I think that has been something that I've been thinking about throughout the day up to this point. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for that very provocative set of interventions. I want to just ask whether I'm hearing correctly, firstly. What I'm hearing are 3 propositions of the work that Black Studies might want to do in this moment. And so in Denai's work on study, Linda Koshle's sense of what Adorno would have called an emphatic concept, a concept that you want to adhere to but that does not exist. Yeah. And then in Siseko's sense, voicing of structure, a kind of new articulation into structure. Now, I want to ask whether we ought to be thinking about limits here in each of your propositions on what is possible and what is not possible within the realms of Black study. And I ask this question particularly from a perspective, and I'm going to claim a little bit of an essentialist position here, of being in a historically Black university, where it doesn't matter how much you shout from the rafters, you will not be heard. I mean, this is, when I read Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, it kind of dawned on me that that's right, You're not just not going to be heard. It doesn't matter. So I wondered, working back from that limit, which is what is the habit I've sought to cultivate inhabiting this space of a historically Black university, might be more productive in a sense. And so I'm wondering if you could just specify how you think about that limit in relation to those three ideas of what Black studies might be doing: study, emphatic concept, and in Siseko's case, voicing of structure.
There has been historically a way in which Black studies, United States style, has framed many arguments about Blackness globally. And I'm wondering whether or not in the South African context does not have the capacity, and I think it does, to think through that question. After all, you gave us Biko. To think through that question about Blackness globally, and to think about what does Black study mean. There's a group of young people in the States, some of them are at the University, I am at Brown, that have developed something called a dark Black study, drawing from Spiller's Winter and some amount of Afro-pessimism, Frederick Wilderson, and so on. But that is still very much a position looking at African America. It's not a position that looks at the way in which global Blackness operates. And there's a certain globality to Blackness. There's a way in which the strength of the American Academy and so on dominates without us, and I'm speaking as part of the Academy, without us taking into consideration other configurations of Blackness and what that might actually mean, and how then can we think about a global Blackness, a global certain kind of disposability of a Black body, a global lack of Blackness, a global kind of meaning of what Blackness means. So that's my first question, and an appeal as well, quite frankly. My second is this, that it might be worthwhile thinking about Black freedom, not as a kind of ideal, but to think of freedom as a possible moving target that never has an end, that always opens up onto something else. But that to do that might require us to work through what I call the archive of the ordinary. That is to think about the everyday, yes, but to think about other archives, to think about a sonic language archive. My colleague from UJ, I think he knew I was going to say this because he and I have had this kind of debate in January, I think it was sometime last year, that to think about the archives where you don't have to read them. So you don't read the sound, you don't read the art, because each of these are actual practices of thought itself that produces its own language, and that you have to then grapple with that language, which then means that you are actually disturbing disciplinary protocols. And that therefore part of what might be important for us to think in the global Blackness, not the old signs of, and I say that with deep respect, of Pan-Africanism, nation states and so on. But it might be to think about circularities, circulations, jazz, but also to think of a certain kind of movement and motion of the notions that are produced elsewhere in the black world, and how then those might get taken up. Not taken up and then stamped on and said, okay, this is it, but taken up in a way of adaptability and reinvention, so that we can then begin to really have a really serious dialogue, which I think we need to have in the black world, about between Africa, African America, the Caribbean, and Brazil, which is part of what we try to do in the exhibition. May not have succeeded 100%, but anybody who looks at the exhibition will see that this is actually an attempt to have a certain dialogue in the black world without us labeling it Pan-Africanism or black internationalism, which I prefer, but to begin to think about a certain kind of blackness in a black world, and how in the 21st century we can actually navigate that and construct such a world, but importantly, how we can name it in categories.
Yesterday, we spent a lot of time in the museum, and the three of us. It's so interesting that we went in the same time, and of course there was the retrospective of Stephen Cohen, the agent provocateur, like what he did, and those debates that happened in the 2000s and so forth. And indeed, we wrestled with. I'll speak for myself that I wrestled with the exhibition because, like, it is the things that I've been invested on. That I'm reading blackness not from a nationalist project. Those who know my work, like I refuse this thing of being contained, precisely because of the way my world was formed. That I don't come from the rural areas. I come from Soweto, so that kind of world. And when you go to Johannesburg, as a young boy, what you see, what your parents are going through in the face of whiteness, and that bravery to say, won't be shaken by whiteness. My father refused to move from the pavement, right? And something which still continues in Pretoria. People, when the white person comes in the pavement, they shift. It happens like today, and this is what I'm even teaching my children, that look at them in the eye. Like, if they're playing those liberal games, they're like, be aware, be hypersensitive, like, because these are the things that black people are going through all over the world. Like, I'm saying this to punctuate the issue of being black in the world, right? And in fact, being black in an anti-black world, no matter how much you can scream, I can't breathe, right? They'll tell you, screw your breath, and they will break your neck. That's how, like, it operates everywhere in the world. There are these markers. Even in the absence of whiteness, right? People like who have traveled in most parts of the world, like what happens to us at airports, what I call aviation racism, right? We are being pulled aside, we are being searched, and then it's when you produce papers, like, that, enjoy your stay in Germany. So you are carrying this body, which is a crime wherever you go, whether you like it or not, whether, like, you don't believe in racism. And it was so funny that there was a time when I traveled with a professor who doesn't believe in racism in this country, and I was so happy what happened to him at Heathrow Airport. I was so happy, right? Because there's a sense in which there is this disavowal of what black people are going through, and the kind of disciplining when people are saying we are going through this pain. And I'm not saying this because of petition politics, like, that, oh, hear my cry, I'm going through this. We're not doing that. And when I say Black Study, I meant that kind of attitude where we don't seek permission. We can take, a Derridian text, whether it's Hegel, I will read him. Nobody is going to stop me. And I will inject my sensibilities into him, right? That Black point of view. We saw what happened with the Western instruments, right? We saw the radio, what it was done. And I was thinking of the medium wave when Mohammed was working here, of Black people listening to Radio Freedom during apartheid, covered in the blankets, right? Even those distortions, but they were deciphering meaning. And this is what Black Study is. That this archive that we're speaking about, Professor Pokes, the way we wear, the way we appear, the way we speak, I come from a culture where we speak Stamto, in Soweto, Totital, right? Even the way I interact with the world, with the text. And there are these many worlds that are existing. And of course, the practices of freedom, it does not mean that it must be given to me or it must exist. Black people had freedom even during apartheid, right? Even if they knew that, oh, I'm gonna get arrested, even if when I'm in jail, I'll practice it. And one common side that I would like to think about seriously, and something which I'm very obsessed in having to study, political speeches before the judge. I'm thinking about Sobukwe, I'm thinking about Biko, that when they saw a judge, they didn't see somebody who is presiding over the court on their fate. They themselves were judges. They critiqued apartheid, right? So those speeches, if one thinks about them, in that limit of having to be, knowing that I'm gonna go through a death sentence, but I am going to say what I'm going to say. Not that they wanna hear me. Not that the apartheid juridical system is gonna hear my plight, but that moment that Black people, they stole to say what they wanted to say before they will be thrown to the gallows, right? So that for me is interesting, that Black people stole only one day on weekend, Sunday, right? When they go to church, that I'll wear that suit every Sunday, but it will be different, right? I'll wear the same pair of shoes, but they'll be different, right? So I believe that this is thing of self-making, that's Black Study in itself. It's not, oh, let's come and do a study group, or Moten tells us, and then we come there, rub our egos. No. But it's our parents, they've been doing it. We know, of those guys, who are making existence out of nothing. The photographers that we're wrestling with, Candice, that's Black Study, right? And it's cool knowing that I'm gonna put the camera inside, and then get into the minds, inside the bread. So I am of the view that the thing that has compromised South African Black academy, we know the crisis that happened. Pretty much, you know what you fought against in the 90s, that you refused to go to the policy spaces, promising you money. You remained at the university, marginalized, but you continued, and you didn't know what was the future of what you're doing, right? Being called crazy, but you continued, right? So that's Black Study, believing in it even if it is not there. You do this, and the tragedy of the 1990s was this: that Black radical thinkers, they made them to go to government, to do policies, and then we lost theorists, right? And then we had the liberal academy coming into being. 2000s, it was the same thing, right? It's only later when, Black radical theorists are coming, right? And we need those small gains and to make a big deal out of them. And this explains. Yes, there has been many registers of Afro-pessimism, decoloniality, those pockets, let's exhaust them. But I am saying when the liberal machine comes to appropriate them, right? Because you will see, everybody hates Afro-pessimism, but you'll see now in 3 years, everybody will be Afro-pessimist. We'll even have the research chair in Afro-pessimism. As soon as that happens, that's where we need to move. Like, it's like even fashion. In fashion, we see things like grunge, people wearing like dirty clothes and stuff. Then when Vogue magazine covers them, it's now commercial, right? The music that was underground, right? When the machine comes and take, that's where we have to move. Okay, have your radical thing. We are doing something else. Like, so, Siseko, this is like what I was saying. Just in short, that we have to let go of the logic of possession, right? This thing of being invested in purity. That's where they will get us, because if they take what is ours, because we are not there to repossess, like in the first, we are there to offer. Black study, it's offering, right? We give, right? Prof. Box, you know the work that we did on Africana studies at Brown, the battles that we had, the lawyers that were sent to you to be discouraged. But you continued, right? With the band of students who said, we're gonna do this. Some, they even said, you can't be in the philosophy department. But Africana studies is standing. When they take it, you move to something else. That's what I was saying.
Yes, I'm going to be a little bit more systematic in addressing the questions than my colleague here. I don't know how to use your earlier term, how to riff. Yeah, I'm a bit stiff that way. So the first question is about whether there's been Black studies in South African departments, I suppose. So I can't speak for the entire corpus of university in South Africa, but I can speak for philosophy, and the answer is no. I don't know if you want me to expand. No. So, particularly because, again, of the Manichaeism of philosophy, this conversation between reason and non-reason, ethno-philosophy. I mean, if you take a look at it, it has always been there, right? Someone like Edward Blyden is taken to be a cultural studyist, whereas he was actively involved in speaking about blackness, black consciousness, and projecting into, in a prophetic way, what we should be doing to fix the current conditions of being black. And that already was in the 1920s, right, within philosophy. But because there was always the standard of what philosophy is, of course, then it would not, you know. And again, even if there's attempts now, calling it Black studies turns into something kind of anthropological, right? It's, earlier I was saying to a colleague, it almost invites stories about your village, right? So you then say, well, here's this white feminist concept that doesn't quite cover the experiences of African people. Instead, I offer you a Swati concept where I say, okay, you may call it this, we call it uktamba. And all of a sudden that works as criticality. So, and they let us get away with it for the reasons that Tendai is speaking about, right? Because now I no longer have to do the critical work. It's enough to just inject your anthropological experience. We tick off the exercise. We've done the work. Surely the Black people should be satisfied. You can talk about your village now in ways you couldn't before. We're not rejecting it. We're not saying it's ethno-philosophy. We're saying it's standpoint theory, right? Which is a dangerous thing again, about, you know, the discourses about freedom and intelligibility and all of that are happening around Black people as we're trying to think about our agency and all of that. I think we find ourselves now, speaking to the second question, speaking about Black life in a way where there's another table over there. And we should be satisfied with the fact that, oh, say for example, psychology is quite white, let's introduce an ancestral version of this, right? But it doesn't quite destabilize what psychology is. But we should be happy with that. Why? Because it's here and we can shout and we can scream, as we're saying, and we can wear our traditional garbs and so on and so forth, right? When they encourage us on Heritage Day, say, come in your clothes, it's fine, right? We like, exactly, right? So, to the point then of the second one, what kind of ways are emerging of speaking about Black life? When I think about African feminism, I think the first, when you're speaking about, I think you said states of Black life versus this master-slave dynamic. So you get thinkers like Nkirunzweku, Oyeronke Oyewumi, Sylvia Tamali, who I believe have very good diagnoses of the problem of the relationship between the West and Africa, and particularly how we think about gender dynamics and so on and so forth. However, again, with these co-option conversations, that is taken and becomes the substantiation of saying it's simply enough for me to do ethnographic exercises that show the difference between us and the West, right? Difference has become a misnomer for critique. And I think that's a very dangerous place that we are sitting in, right? Because you're told you must retrieve, right? As you're saying, Kumalo, retrieve the stories of Umkai, retrieve the whatnot, right? But what do we do with them if they're not moving us forward into the conversation of freedom, right? Now we just know that there are people who used to speak Iziko. Sorry? No, I just mean in terms of the blackout. They still do. People still speak Iziko. Sorry about that framing, right? And so I think part of it is the temptation to want to resist Western epistemes, I think, particularly in African philosophy, has done this work of closing off into this culturalist conversation in a very dangerous way. I think that resists the kind of things that Prof is speaking about, like how do we connect it to a global issue? And I think thinkers like Fanon and Cabral have always told us what's important is that this must always link back to solidarity. It must always link back to bigger structural issues. Otherwise, to quote a Palestinian philosopher, is he Palestinian? Somewhere in that region, I apologize. Zahir Zalua, he says, instead then that's when you can descend into these kind of identity politics. This kind of, please see me. It's enough if you pay me this money, this restitution monies and all sorts of things, because it's feel-good stuff. If your experience as a group only resides with you and you cannot connect it to other experiences, then maybe you should question if that's truly a structural issue, right? Case in points, the 49 who went to America, right? If we can have a problem with that, I argue we should have a problem with, for example, those who are doing these movements to chase away our fellow African brothers and sisters. There is no connection to a larger structural issue. So again, the problem with these issues of myopic culturalist views is that you can have a problem with the 49 Afrikaners, but you think it's not inconsistent for you to be doing what you're doing now, right? So Zahir Zalua, I think's point is, at every given point where you are thinking you're resisting, the best way to check if that is actually what is going on is to link it back to structural issues, which is why I would always say to Kumalo here that, you know, I think we have enough. I think our thinkers, Fanon, Cabral, all of these sorts of now canonized, and I understand that you're saying that means they've been co-opted. I don't think they fully understand these thinkers, but I think they are there and they are explicitly pointing to, here's what you need to do. You know, they kind of left us a blueprint to say, if you're going to think through the problems of your day, think about it in connection to these structural issues. Otherwise, you're going to descend into these little pockets, right, where you're fighting each other, makes it easy for right-wing politics to come in and tell you the issue of the white worker cannot connect to the issue of the black person in America. These are problems that are speaking to a larger issue of a capitalist and racialized system. Yes, I think I agree. In thinking about the everyday, I think I'm thinking about more so of an imminent issue. Transcendental thinking, I just struggle with. Simply because reality just makes it hard to be hopeful. And so for me, I kind of interact with the everyday because these larger scale issues I said earlier, for me, I think it's obvious what we need to do. But it's better for me, I think, to tap into the imminent everydayness rather than looking at these kind of bigger, prolific ways of black being that are resisting in smaller ways. And I think it's more true to reality. So earlier, as I said, I do work around black women, and currently, again, around trying to be deviant, thinking about limits, how to navigate these effective concepts or emphatic concepts. I'm trying to currently do empirical work in philosophy, precisely because it's difficult to tap into the everyday using philosophy as it is. Philosophy itself is the limit. And so when you think about, you know, I don't know if we must abandon it. You know, there's a student who once said to me, you know, you professors, you get to the top, you write all of these things, and you get there and you say we must let things go. Now you no longer want to do that. Now this is a futile exercise. Now this is this and that, right? Because it's nice now with your many books. So those concepts, these concepts are great, and when they were working for you and all of that, and now when we need you to, when you have the social capital to do something, that's the exact moment when you give up. And I think there's something about the everyday then that allows for us not to give up so easily, right? Rather than thinking about in these kind of transcendental ways, be deviant. But what does that really mean to be deviant, right? If, as you're saying, now being grunge has been co-opted, what would being deviant really mean? That it's easy to say these things, right? We kind of wax lyrical about it. So I think the tapping into the everyday allows us to be more intellectually honest about what is actually possible given these limits that we're dealing with. And then finally, to Pramesh's question, sure. I want to say we must think about ways of being that exceed this totalizing logic. But again, I'm not so sure if I'd be able to spot it because I'm so encumbered by these ways of thinking. But again, when I think about now this empirical research, I want to do research in the kingdom of Eswatini because I think it's a very interesting context. It's a place where women can't go and get a bank loan without their husband. But it's also a place where there's a law against sexual harassment. You can't be catcalled in Swaziland. I mean, you can, but you get arrested, right? How is that possible? What is happening there that allows for women to be structurally denied, but on some level they're being heard? So what are they doing that allows for this? And I think that fracture, that I think there's an exceeding happening there that we can tap into. The Swatini context again is interesting because most Nguni cultures valorize virginity in women, and the Swati culture is valorized in men. There's something there that makes for that culture. I'm not saying violence doesn't happen there, but it's not as endemic in other places in Africa. Whether it's because of scale, whether it's because of, I'm not sure. But I think it makes for an interesting context, especially because it endures as still a colonial state, but still people are practicing their culture in their everyday, in their food, in the way that they speak. We're constantly having all of these umhlanga dances, this and that. There's constantly something happening in Swaziland around this culture. So there's something that women are doing there that is quite interesting. Again, and I think that maybe could be something to be speaking about, where the fractures are exceeding these limits. And we can tap into that and see what can we do. I think for me, just as long as it's not in an ideal way, I'm very suspicious of the move of going to pre-colonial Africa, as is the case in African feminisms, and saying, well, we didn't do gender. In my Yoruba culture, we used to do this. I mean, it's already a projection into the past. There is no one-to-one relationship between language and how society works. There's all sorts of problems with that, right? And I'm not so sure, again, like as I said earlier, that it's doing the work of contesting power. So in going to these cultural settings, it's not to search for the truth of those people, but to think about the problems that are common to all of us, like heteropatriarchy, and the ways in which, in using their culture, the ways in their everyday, they're able to exceed in ways that we could possibly tap into, that call us to action. Because these are not, they're not exceeding, just. These are things that are bettering their lives. These are things that are shifting the law, that are forcing particular changes, even if it's not at the pace that we would desire. But something is going on there that's more than just a story of my culture, a story of my own little corner in the world. There's something that we can connect to, a joint experience that allows for us to maybe start thinking about what does this limit mean and what is possible given this limit.
I want to start with my colleagues up here and address two responses. And the first is an objection and the second is a concession, right? The objection is to Ukam. And I think it sort of revolves around the project of retrieval, right? What has happened, I think, in African philosophy for the longest time is that retrieval has been styled as an anthropological project, a romanticized looking back. And I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in the romantic gazing back. I'm interested in understanding how Ogoba, Omkai, Onziko negotiate their world for the purposes of saying, what did they see that we are not seeing, that we can deploy in the moment to go beyond the liberal tradition, right? To think outside of the liberal tradition. So, and it's not a valorization, because these are complicated figures, very complicated figures, and I appreciate their complicatedness. I appreciate their complicity. I appreciate their revolutionary thought, because they are all of those things in one. Now, to suggest that this is a retrieval in the valorizing anthropological sense is to absolve them of their complicity and their complicatedness, which I don't. So that's an objection. I don't want the room to leave here thinking I'm on a retrieval romanticization project. I don't. The Black Archive is not that. It is a retrieval that seeks to find a language that named a system that was being introduced, that changed a world. And I do think that sticking with an analysis of the system, we can find intervention points. That's the first one. To my good brother, the letting go is a nice one. And I think you are pushing me towards something that I say I want to do, but I don't want to do, right? And part of the reason why I've become suspicious of decolonization is because of its downstream logic, right? I am writing a paper. I do think in my head, it's still in my head, it's not yet on paper, but I'm writing it, around why, as a decolonialist, I don't quite like decolonization anymore. The downstream effects are a fundamentally exclusionary nationalism, both conceptually and politically. We saw what happened in Uganda. We saw what happened with Kukurahundi in Zimbabwe in the 1980s. We saw what happened in Rwanda in 1994. And that is the outcome, the logical conclusion of decolonization. All of those processes are processes of founding the nation, and the process of founding the nation is defined by inclusion and exclusion, and that exclusion takes on various forms. So letting go then means also letting go of the notion of isizwe sikaZulu, wena Jobe. What does it mean then to let go of isizwe sikaZulu, to let go of uMageba, to let go of the very thing that allows me to name myself as umuntu ngumzilikazi uMashobane uMakhungumbulazi abathi umuntu beminga ngendaba? What does that angazi? I honestly have no idea. But you are pointing to something that I think is useful and is necessary, precisely because in complicating the formation of the nation, I think there's something that's worthwhile there, right? Then to Primesh's question, what are the limits? For me, the limit is, the first one is the linguistic one, right? The texts that I am engaging with are written in isiXhosa, some are written in Setswana, some are written in isiZulu, which means that they are accessible only to a few folks who can read those languages. Because also remember that what happens in the academy is that as we get educated, as we get our PhDs, as we ascend into the professoriate, we get alienated even from our own languages as Black scholars, that we can't even read our own languages. So that's the first limit. And the question then becomes, how do we overcome that limit, right? Is it to teach the languages? Is it to, I don't know, have no idea around that. The second is the disciplinary. I am a philosopher. So when I'm reading Umkhai, I am reading him necessarily and interpreting him through a philosophical analysis. Whether it is to say that I'm reading him for the purposes of developing political theory, whether it is to say that I'm reading him to understand an articulation of ontology, I'm still reading him within those particular categories. That's another limit. However, there are scholars like you that exist. And those scholars transcend even the linguistic limitations, right? And you might say, how do you mean, Siseko? Or the folks in the room might say, but what do you mean? Pramesha's book on the deaths of Yinza is a very useful example of how somebody who, unlike me, did not ncela isiZulu okanye ke isiXhosa ebeleni, can be able to access an entire world and pose very, very useful questions that give us very generative theoretical tools. So you are the embodiment of speaking back to the limitations, maybe, through your own scholarship, I would suggest. We shall. And then as a last, and I think to Anthony's question around the Black Archive, this is precisely the work that we're doing, Anthony, right? It's to say what exists in the musical repertoire of Black artists who continued to protest against the state using music, and whose music circulated. Some of it were banned, some of it was banned, some of it was listened to underground. But musicians continued to do the work of thinking about the South African condition, about Black. And they did that to mobilize an entire nation to continue the armed, not the armed, but the political resistance, right? It's in the literature. In the quote-unquote fictional tales of Ingqumbo Yeminyanya, The Wrath of the Ancestors by A.C. Jordan, where there's this incredible contestation between modernity and tradition. And we think about those questions to say what is... And we don't think about them from a hermeneutics perspective. We don't think about them from a literary interpretation perspective. Those are texts that were read and consumed by the everyday person, just for funsies, right? And so the question becomes, how do we read the circulation of Ingqumbo Yeminyanya, Ikalamawele? How do we read those texts? It goes to the artwork. To appreciate Dumile Fene's African Guernica for the incredible ontological claim that he's making in that composition, without trying to do an art theory or art history analysis of the image, but to read the ontological stakes that he's putting by foregrounding beasts and having humans recede into the background. He's making a major, major claim about the function of apartheid as a dehumanizing process for Black life, right? And that's what the Black Archive is trying to do. The Black Archive is collecting those texts, music, art, literature, poetry, to think about what Black creatives, what Black cultural workers were doing to use Lee's concept of the cultural worker, what black cultural workers were doing to think beyond the state, to find those ruptures of freedom, even if freedom was delimited. And that's what the Black Archive is about, fundamentally, which is why, then, it is not a romantic retrieval. It is a retrieval that says, what are the tools we can find to liberate ourselves? Angehlele ngezansi, Sihlalo, awuqhubeke. Moritz?
As the three of you are responding, and I'm thinking of Sobukwe's response to Pogrund, when Pogrund says, but your concept of African becomes a racialized concept, and Sobukwe says, well, that's a problem for pedagogy. Yeah? Or Biko's sense that these structures can only be shifted by working one person at a time through a question of consciousness, right? A structure doesn't exist up there, it's built on consciousness. And so the task, working from Fanon, is to change the target of consciousness, right? Where, you know, the black-white metaphysics that he speaks of in Black Skin, White Masks. The black man wants to be white, the white man is desperately trying to attain the rank of man. And for him, it's to break those targets. Both categories need to shift, yeah, for a possible future. So much to dive into. Retrieval all depends on what you retrieve. This is the discussion between Siseko and Linda Kuchle, yeah. But we can have that over wine. So I want all of us, if we could please give one more round of applause for our panelists. Then we wanted, as a small gesture to the Simpson Center for hosting this with us, we wanted to just give a small gift to Professor Bogues of recent works that have come from the CHR. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.